got a question for you. There's a prize in this question. It's an organic, homegrown pumpkin. I guarantee it's homegrown because I grew it, and I guarantee it's organic because I'm too lazy to spray stuff. Now, last week I was in Countdown, and you could buy a quarter of a pumpkin. So if you bought 4 quarters, you'd end up with a pumpkin. What would it have cost you? So the first person to get within 10% of the right answer gets the pumpkin. 14 we had here, 15 at the back.
22.
22 over here.
9.
9.
12.
12.
20.
20.
32.
How much?
10.
10.
I said 32.
How much?
32.
32.
28.
28. Who said that? Pumpkin voice. 28 bucks for a pumpkin. Congratulations. So we're here to talk about food resilience, and we're not here just to talk about agriculture resilience. We've deliberately picked the topic food because it's a food system. So where do you think that $28 pumpkin came from, and how much money do you think the grower got? And was it a grower in South Canterbury, or was it somewhere up north? Who got the money from that pumpkin? And if our growers don't get it, the growers are going to really struggle. So we're going to be talking about food resilience tonight, and it's the whole system. But as part of that, if the growers don't get enough return, we don't have a food system. However, in South Canterbury, 95% of the food we buy here comes from outside South Canterbury, and half of that comes from overseas. Now, I don't know if you're all comfortable with that, but I'm not particularly comfortable with that. As Nigel will tell us, we produce several $1 billion worth of food in South Canterbury, and yet we bring in 95% from outside. Last week, I got an email from Countdown saying, I'm sorry there won't be quite so many vegetables, especially mandarins, because the roading network in the Hawke's Bay has been affected by Cyclone Gabriel. So climate change affects the food supply here, not just climate change here. So I'm going to give you some key climate change messages. I'm going to talk about the topic of commercial food resilience and the subtopics under there. And I'm going to briefly touch on the idea of a South Canterbury Climate Trust. Now, some of the key messages that we've been working on. It's scientifically unequivocal that climate change is happening and humans are causing it. Now, that's based on a report by the IPCC, which had 350 independent scientists, some of whom were from New Zealand, analysed 30,000 scientific papers, and that was their conclusion. If you have any evidence that that is wrong, please let me know. Otherwise, climate change is unequivocal and we are causing it. The impacts are inevitable. We've already got enough carbon dioxide and other gases in the atmosphere. We've got enough heat in the ocean that we're going to have impacts from climate change for at least 100 years, probably 300 years, because that's how long it takes for the carbon dioxide to decay. Taking action is optional until it's too late. So you don't have to take action to move your house away from where it's going to get flooded until it gets flooded. Or you can choose to leave earlier, and almost without exception, it pays to take action before the events happen. Why aren't we acting on stuff? Climate action hesitancy. Many of us, myself included, are absolutely committed to doing something about climate change, and I still drive a petrol car. So why do we hesitate? This is one of the key ones. There's a lack of trusted climate change information that really impacts on us right here. There's all sorts of international publications and whatever. What does it mean to us? If sea level rises around our coast, what does it mean to you? If we're going to get more flooding, if we're going to get longer droughts, what does it mean to you? And we don't have sufficiently accurate answers on that information. And there's legislative uncertainty. The government's frantically working through a whole lot of climate change policies, the adaptation one being a big one. Who pays when things go wrong? There's over 400,000 homes at risk of flooding in New Zealand. The cost of replacing them is $218 billion. You think the taxpayers are going to front up with that? I'm not sure. So we've got some huge issues out there. Our council has made some commitments on climate change to be a climate-friendly council, and we've got some really good actions underway by local staff, led by Rhys Taylor, who's outside, and supported by Troy here, who's got the challenging job of keeping all the electronics and AV going tonight. Second commitment from the council, lead and facilitate projects with others, and that's what we're working on at the moment. And encourage others to learn and adapt to climate change. But this is the key focus. I'm going to talk about the strategy work we're doing at the moment. So Timaru District contracted me as an independent consultant to help the district develop a climate change strategy. Rhys is developing a strategy for the council. I'm doing the one for everybody else. We're trying to help that happen. And a lot of other players have their own strategies up and running. So I know Alpine Energy, for example, is developing a strategy around climate change, AFAs and so on. So I don't need to get involved in that. But there's a lot of topics that nobody is taking responsibility for. So that's what we're focusing on. I'm supported by Troy and Rhys, but I'm fiercely independent. My job is to represent our communities. We have an advisory group of 24. The mayor is on that. The chair of the Environmental Services Committee, Councillor Michelle Pye, and she's here tonight, is on that committee. And that group keeps me honest, because I have a lot of opinions around climate change, and they challenge me on them, which is the way it should be. We've had several hundred people at 9 meetings so far, over 1,500 hours of community inputs. We've developed a set of principles. These are available online. We've looked at 17 major topics, and we're working on 6 of them, and we've got a lot more to do. And tonight's meeting is the 6th of those topics. And staff are focusing on anything that, I say, TDC has to do in-house. Majority of climate actions happen in the community. So we've assessed so far that the impacts of climate change between now and 2030 are going to be in the tens of hundreds of millions of dollars. And they will happen primarily in our communities. It's us who's going to be affected. It's going to affect businesses, farmers, community groups, individuals, local authorities, government agencies, ecosystems will be affected. And we've got to somehow get all these players to work together. If we look at the complexity of commercial food resilience, the food chain, it's a $3+ billion sector. So a 5% climate impact like a drought would cost us 150 million in 1 year. Only need a 5% impact. That's the scale of what we're dealing with here. We're not dealing with a few million here and there. We're dealing with tens and hundreds of millions of dollars worth of impact. It's going to affect growers, processors, contractors, local transporters, international shipping, consumers. Consumer worldwide demand is changing, as we'll hear about tonight. So rapidly changing export markets. The nature of the impact will be floods, droughts, fires, inundation of productive land. There's one farmer north of here who's already had 40 hectares of land affected by saltwater inundation. And dairy land worth, what, 30 grand a hectare, 4 threes, you do the sums. I won't try and do it, it's a lot of money. There's adaptation we have to work on and mitigation. And we need to genuinely look at future ideas. And there's a lot of uncertainties and risks. So one of the key points tonight, we're going to be throwing a lot of information at you. Nobody's giving anybody advice. It's simply saying, this is the information that's coming to the surface. You make your own risk assessment on this, because the risks, we haven't fully quantified a lot of those. So we need to find and validate the answers, not just opinions at the pub. We need to get hard data. We need to say, is this true or not? Is it really going to affect us, or is it just some greedy going off on a rant? I'd give you one warning though. And this is a quote from a philosopher, a favourite of mine, H.L. Mencken. He said, for every problem there's a solution that's obvious, and you'll hear a lot of those on the pub. It's plausible, you'll hear a lot of those, and wrong. And this is one of the things we've got to be really careful about. It's very easy to jump to a conclusion that that's what we ought to do. So people have said we need to reduce the carbon footprint by having farmers markets. The carbon footprint associated with a farmer's market is about 10 times higher than the carbon footprint of food coming out of the supermarket, because of all the transport required to bring small quantities of food to the farmer's market and take small quantities away again. People say, oh, we've got to reduce road transport, all those big trucks. A truck bringing 40 tonne of food from Christchurch to here uses a certain amount of energy or has certain emissions. The emissions of us taking that food home from the supermarket are between 1 and 300 times the emissions of the truck. So the emissions are us, not the truck. So those are the sort of things where we've got to be really careful we don't jump to conclusions too soon. Okay, our speakers tonight, we've got Nigel Davenport, Venture Timaru, talking about sustainable as attainable. There's some amazing stuff going on, especially in the Washtike area that Nigel can talk about. We'll hear from Melissa Clark-Reynolds. Now, Melissa's been working in future thinking for a long time, looking at international trends. Has got a wealth of information for us. We'll hear from Rhys from Timaru District Council. He's just had the pleasure of going to the UK, and he took a whole lot of photographs from inside the supermarkets. Really interesting story there. Professor Anita Wreford, looking at adapting our current systems as part of what's called the Deep South Challenge, a major research project. And then Professor Alan Renwick talking about future food production in Canterbury. So at this point, I'll hand over to Nigel Davenport from Venture Timaru, and I'm sure you can tell us what Venture Timaru does. Thank you.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Nigel Davenport, taka whenua. I am Nigel Davenport, Chief Executive of Venture Timaru, with the Economic Development and Tourism Agency for the Timaru District. Thanks for the opportunity to come along and talk tonight. Excuse the voice, I had man flu a couple of weeks ago, and lucky to survive. It's one of the worst things you can get. I tell my wife, but I don't get the sympathy back. So excuse the voice. The hearing's coming and going a bit, so I'll answer the questions I want to and all the others. But no, I joke. Okay, first thing, important we set the scene here. So the point I want to make initially is that we have the largest and most diverse range of food processors and manufacturers in a geographically close location than anywhere else in the country. Okay, as you can see there, that's a good number of them. There are others of all different shapes and sizes, but you'll appreciate their dairy, meat, seafood. Got it in a good food processing sector, you've got to have the brewery in the middle there as well, so that's always good to have. Salmon, you name it, honey, the whole works. So the reason they're here, smack in the middle of the South Island, proximity to suppliers, the research and development resource that's only a couple of hours each side of us. 80% of the South Island population's within that 2.5 hours of us. Accessible, very capable servicing sector, diversely skilled workforce, high quality, accessible, affordable water, and state highway, rail, port, airport. The contribution that this sector makes, they make up nearly 5,000 of our 26,000 workforce in the Timaru district, notwithstanding the wider South Canterbury. They generate, to come back to Phil's point, they generate 7.3% of our food and fibre exports, which is approximately just under $4 billion. Now that's only from 1.2% of our population. So we talk often around the grunt that South Canterbury provides to New Zealand, and it's important that it's recognised in that way rather than the GDP contribution. The reason for that is, boring technical economic development terms, GDP, a lot of those entities get offices outside the area, so they're effectively running a break-even cost centre. But interesting enough, those food and fibre exports have increased nearly 82% in the past 5 years alone. They are also entities that provide a wide support over and above, obviously, the wages, etc., and the multiplier effect through our community, but they also provide significant support through many aspects of our community as well. The food and fibre export destinations off the side there, just to give you a bit of a feel for who's good in the hood. for us, and who we export to as well. The mahi-tahi that's underway at the moment. So the one thing about our food and fibre sector here, I use the term often that South Canterbury, we're big enough but small enough, big enough that we have diversity of industry sector. We have these global, and in some cases, DB Heineken, McCain's, and large national companies like Fonterra and Sanford, Silverfern Farms, etc. But we're also small enough that everyone's only a phone call away. So the one thing I would say about the wider business community is that, including the food and fibre sector, is that there is a high level of collaboration and connectivity, which is a massive foundation for us all to do some pretty significant things and do them probably a lot quicker than other parts of the country. Sustainable is attainable. This was an initiative we established with our food processors and manufacturers about 4 or 5 years ago. This is an unprecedented level of collaboration, 20 plus companies actually sitting around the table looking at their waste streams. I use this term endearingly, they're our biggest wasters, and that's a nice term I use for them. They are also our biggest energy users as well. So having that group of our local businesses sitting around the table and actually sharing best practice, but also looking into things around their waste streams such as these is hugely important. As you can see up the top there, this initiative now is in the Hawke's Bay and is shortly to head into the Manawatu. We're talking to Nelson as well. So there's no IP associated with this. This is a collaboration of like-minded people who are up for doing the right thing on a number of fronts, including their waste streams, including their energy use, etc. Those companies, who's involved, the ones I showed you locally, but from a academia world, this is the connectivity we have through the University of Canterbury. They act as our conduit into the academia world. You'll see some government agencies in there, Timaru District Council sitting at the table, and rightly so, Ag Research and a few others sitting in here as well. Some of the stuff that's underway, all sorts of things around their value extraction, their value add, their circular economy, biohydrogen fermentation from DAF sludge, anaerobic digestion, plastic shredders, protein extraction from either plant-based or utilising soldier flies, vermicast, worm farms, etc. From an energy perspective, and great to have Carolyn and the crew from Alpine Energy here as well. We were fortunate enough, we're the second region in the country to have the ECA's Regional Energy Transition Accelerator Report, RETA we call it because it takes too long to say that. And this is actually a pathway to decarbonisation. We're the second region behind Southland to do this. We kicked it off in July last year. The report is out now. It's been out for a couple of 3 weeks. It is not the silver bullet here around our future energy, and Alpine Energy, along with local stakeholders, are kicking off what it actually means for South Canterbury. It's one piece of the jigsaw. But importantly, a couple of things just to highlight through the RETA report. It identified 33 sites. So these are process heat users, effectively coal users. 78 projects identified. There's about 8 underway already. And we're talking that amount of energy, that amount of kilotons of emissions. But importantly to say that through the report, they've identified pathways to reduce those emissions by 90% by 2036, which is a huge reduction. That is dependent on motivation, it's dependent upon commitment, and it's dependent on co-funding as well. So there is the opportunity, as you can see there, the BAU is very much, let's do something right at the end. Yep, we got there. Or there is that commitment locally, as I say, those companies that have progressed some of these great initiatives already and are well down the dial, helping inform some of those that are just starting to think about it or are at the front end of the process. So again, the power of collaboration of the big, the small, the medium, and everyone in between. From a supply side perspective, the optimal pathway here around this decarbonisation, it basically results in 40% of the process heat energy being supplied by biomass and 60% by electricity. So I think the thing I wanted to highlight with this part is effectively, yes, the food processing and manufacturing sector is big, but it's also important to us on a variety of fronts. The other thing is that they are already doing a lot of good things in this space around reducing their emissions. Well, wait a minute, the one thing I didn't show was this one here, the well underway. So this talks to the likes of Silver Fern Farms, for argument's sake. In 2020, they were utilising 4,200 tonnes of coal. By 2023, that will reduce down to 2,600, and they're looking at zero coal use by 2030. Wool Scours have recently electrified their boilers from coal, reducing emission by 11,000 tonnes per annum, which is about equivalent of 3,000 cars off the road. Pioneer Energy converted their centre from coal to biomass. They've reduced emissions by 14,000 tonnes, which is another 3,000 cars off the road. McCain, the really cool thing here, I'll just highlight DB and McCain. At the ECA Large Energy Awards last year, these two companies locally were finalists in the Large Energy Awards, or Large Entity Energy Awards, alongside Auckland Transport. We had a conversation with them before they went away and said, look, it doesn't matter who wins, just as long as it's not Auckland. So McCain took it out, as you can see there, but, you know, and big ups to them. You know, they've converted their coal boiler to biomass. They've reduced emissions by 34,500 tonnes, which is about 11,000 cars off the road. So I think what I wanted to highlight here is that this is a group of collaborative, trusting and front-footed industry players that are sitting around the table addressing some of these challenges front on, because it is the right thing to do. There's some great stuff underway already, and there's some great stuff planned as well. You know, the report effectively, or the ECO report, which is one piece of the jigsaw, it illustrates a range of decarbonisation pathways, all of which demonstrate how the combined decisions of a range of process heat users may lead to common infrastructure challenges and opportunities from a supply perspective. But that key one around that elimination, that provides a pathway to look to eliminate those emissions from those sites pretty significantly over coming years. A bit dizzy, sorry about that. Look, the road ahead from a food resilience and future foods perspective, it's all about an informed, coordinated and balanced approach. Climate change is a consideration, but these companies, as are a number of others through our business sector, consumer demand, which will be talked about by some following presenters, automation, artificial intelligence, science, safety and security problems, all these things are facing these entities and our food processing sector at the moment. There's a variety of activities being undertaken. Some recent reports, which are actually all aligned under the Food and Beverage Industry Transformation Plan that was released by MPI in December 22. There's a Fit for a Better World report, Future of the New Zealand Food Sector. Hort NZ have released a Growing Together report, and Well NZ talk of alternative proteins, reframing New Zealand opportunities, modern genetic technology. Again, the point I want to make here is that there's no need for any of us in this room, in this industry sector, us locally, to reinvent any wheels here. There are some pathways and some identified opportunities moving forward. To give you an idea, that's not going to work, is it? Yep. You won't be able to see this, but the Food and Beverage ITP, or the Industry Transformation Plan, sits smack in the middle of this, informed by all these things: agri-tech, fisheries, horticulture action plan, as well as from the top, the Well NZ reports, and from the bottom, the Fit for a Better World. It talks about, you won't be able to read this, sorry, but orienting the sector towards consumers in the market, which will be spoken about, increasing investment in innovation and attracting capital for growth, building capability to innovate, commercialise and improve productive capacity, and regulatory settings that enable food innovation. I think the final point, a couple of bits of data, just everyone loves a bit of data, but this is the outcomes here from the Hort NZ report: grow sustainably, optimise value, Māori being strong in horticulture, underpinned by science and technology, and nurture the people that they need to make the change. Out of the the future of the NZ food sector, you know, it's more. Consumers will need 56% more food by 2050 than they need today. A swing into Asia and Africa. Today's youth, tomorrow's target. This one up here is interesting. Among 60% of the world's largest meat, dairy and seafood companies are already investing in alternative proteins. So they're the ones, they're dealing, you know, their markets, their suppliers, their markets, they're front and centre around the change that is coming potentially to them and their individual products. The application of new technologies and precision agriculture is estimated to increase crop yields by 70%. A lot of info, and there's a lot happening in this space. But, you know, in summary, the one thing I would say, you know, the food and fibre sector locally, or food and processors and manufacturers, they're up for it. There's an unprecedented level of collaboration locally, which is a massive foundation for these companies, their employees and the wider community to do the right thing. Sharing the best practice, and they're ideally placed to lead, as they already are doing in the waste and energy space, but equally so in food resilience. In the future of NZ food sector, I'll leave you with this quote that came out of that document. And it says that demand for New Zealand's existing product mix will likely increase amidst growing global commodity demand arising from population and wealth growth and climate disruptions to worldwide food growing systems. While we are likely to have more regular and severe disruption from climate change and other shocks, our production resilience is relatively better than other food producing countries. This puts us in a good position as we plan for the future, but we will need to build resilience and plan for change. Thank you.
And I think one thing you didn't mention that you did say to me during our conversation was that some of the companies are looking at the technology they've got in the business and saying, what else could we put through this equipment?
Yeah, sorry, I will touch on that. So one of the things that we at VT are looking to undertake with that sector is that in terms of looking at future foods, for argument's sake, and what South Canterbury and indeed New Zealand could potentially be famous for, being informed by all those pieces of work that are being done at the moment, but understanding what those immediate and short-term and longer-term demands are likely to be from the global consumer. But we have that wide variety of food processors and manufacturers that have a wide variety of kit, I'll call it, to do what they're doing. Now, there's an opportunity for us, given that tight collaboration, to actually do a bit of an audit of that kit and go, well, okay, 100%, honey, you've got that kit, it's doing this for you at the moment, but what more could you do that's something aligned? You know, add a widget here or something there and align with other food processors to actually do some other processing as well. So we're just looking at a piece of work and scoping that out at the moment and what that might look like. But that will inform those two pieces of work when you look at the market, when you look at our current capability and what we could potentially do with a bit of a tweak here or a bit more here, will help inform some of those wider opportunities as well. So again, from that basis of collaboration and trust, which we do so well through the Senate of the South Island.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. Yep.
Just about used up the whole time, isn't it?
Yeah, you've still got 3 minutes left. So thanks for that, and I think I find it quite exciting just what a resource we've got here that we can build on, and it's not a whole lot of companies that are just doing things the same old way. They're really getting on the front foot with this stuff. They've got a lot of really good gear. They're improving their carbon footprints. They're improving their environmental management. So we've got a really strong base to build on here. I'd like to introduce Melissa Clark-Reynolds now. Melissa's been involved in thinking about the future for many, many years. I saw a presentation that she did to Dairy New Zealand down in Ashburton a few weeks ago, and I just could not have Melissa here tonight. One thing I would say is that you're seeing a lot of detail in these slides. You're going to be quizzed on the way up. No, you're not. There's no way you can absorb it all. So Troy is recording these presentations. They will be online on the Timaru District Council website when Troy's had time to tidy them up. So you can tap in and get into a lot of this information. So Melissa, over to you. Thank you very much for joining us, and I look forward to your future vision. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, Paul Marie. So good evening, everybody. It's lovely to see such a great turnout. So I am going to run through a presentation, and as was mentioned, you'll be able to get that presentation fairly soon. So I'm just going to talk this through. I think, one of the things as a futurist, what I do is I work mostly in food and agriculture, and I work with large food producers, mostly in New Zealand, but also overseas. I'm on the board of a meat company, and I should tell you, I am on the board of Alpine Energy. I want to be clear, this is not Alpine Energy's view. This is me as a private individual talking today. And a lot of what I do is I work with people like Dairy NZ and government agencies and others to see what might be coming at us. So the first thing that I do is I want to talk about is that every year I go to the States, and one of the things that I look for is I look for the most expensive milk that I can find. And the reason for that is that we've talked for a long time in New Zealand about how we need to be producing premium products so that we can produce less of them and get a higher price back to our farmers. So you can see on the left here, this whole milk Ahimsa dairy on the bottom there. I'm sorry for anyone who the print's too small, but it's $9.30 US for half a gallon. And this is milk that is produced largely for Hare Krishnas and Hindu people who want to be sure that the animals that they're receiving milk from have a good life through their entire life. So in New Zealand, we often deliver very high animal welfare standards, but a typical dairy cow in New Zealand will only last maybe 3 years and then is taken to meat production. So Ahimsa milk, they guarantee that the cow is never killed, will live a full life and will die of old age. And also it means that their calves are kept on with the mother, and at no point until it's natural, the calf weans itself. And so you can see they get this very, very high price for half a gallon of milk. But the farms are typically very small, and it's a very small niche market. So when I look at the mass market, what's interesting is that one up the top there, Alexander Family Farms, they do what I call stacking. So what they do is that they put multiple attributes together to get a high price. And so this first bit here is that it's A2 milk. It's also produced with regenerative and organic processes, and they've added chocolate. And when we think about regenerative organic, there are standards around the world for both regenerative and organic. And so they meet all of those standards, and you can see all the little stickers on the bottle. So I found that really interesting that in terms of mainstream commodity big milk available in a supermarket, $6.09 was the highest price I could find. That's still pretty expensive, and they do an enormous volume. And then on the right, what I found, of course, is milk that is not just saying that it is having a low impact on the environment, but you can see here that there are claims around this neutral milk, that this milk fights climate change. And so it's carbon neutral milk. Now they are using offsets to get there, but what I think you sort of should start to think about with the pattern that we can see in terms of the high prices in international markets is that consumers are looking for a number of attributes, and it includes the way people farm, like regenerative. It includes the kind of milk like A2, and it also, they're really concerned about the impact on the planet of what they do. Now, interestingly, you probably know we're in a global recession. This high price milk has continued to hold its price even as the recession is bit globally. So what we see, and it was mentioned in Nigel's report, is we've also seen this real growth in what we call precision fermentation. So what they've done is that if you think about production of milk in a cow, what we do is we put, and sorry to the farmers in the room, I know this is very simplistic, but we take carbohydrate in the form of grass and plantain and hay and pumpkin or whatever it is, we feed that to a cow and we get milk out. And then out of that milk, we process that milk. And as we know, in our region, there are multiple milk processors. So 2 big Fonterra plants in particular. Milk is a highly processed food, and we don't always think about it like that. But milk is being processed to break out a number of ingredients. And so in New Zealand, we produce things like casein, we produce whey, we produce lactoferrin, which is the iron that's in milk and also known as pink gold, because it's the most expensive ingredient in the milk. Well, what we're starting to see is we're starting to see more and more companies that are taking carbohydrate, they put it into a vat with a whole lot of specialized microbes. And then instead of producing whole milk, what they're doing is they're just producing the ingredient that they wanted. So you can see here, they might be just making the milk fat in that top one, or they might just be making the whey or the casein, or they're making whole milk, which is animal free, but it is bioidentical to milk. So if you put that into some sort of, electron microscope, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between it and whole milk. And we're seeing this real rise of this. What we're also seeing is these very specific proteins that are being added to infant formula. So when we think about infant formula now, we take milk from a cow, we dry it, we then add a pile of additives to it, including, again, palm oil, to make that something that is nearer to breast milk. And so we're seeing a lot of companies now starting to make additives that go into infant formula that are much, much closer to breast milk. And so where I think we'll start to see some of these challenges is that it's not the whole milk market that's under threat from precision fermentation or these new ways of making milk. What it is it's the ingredients market. So instead of having to make milk, people will just make lactoferrin, which is happening already, or they'll just make casein, which goes into cheese, or they'll just make whey. And over time, we would expect them to be making infant formula that is bioidentical to human milk. And so when we think about this bioidentical to human milk, there are 3 big companies around the world that are taking that carbohydrate, they're putting it into these vats with very specialized microbes, and they're making a milk that is as near to human milk as can be made outside of a human. And so we're seeing here that they're working on this technology. It's still not reliable in terms of it's still expensive. But Helena down the bottom there, they've decided to just focus on the lactoferrin. And so what's interesting to me is when I want to see where the next big food trend is coming from, I usually look at American bodybuilders. So American bodybuilders were the people who started keto. They were the people who really got involved with paleo. They're at the forefront of veganism, interestingly. And also they're the biggest consumer of commercial breast milk products in the world. So what they've done is that American bodybuilders are consuming things like cheese made from breast milk. They're consuming this lactoferrin, so this iron supplement made from breast milk. And the most ethical way currently to make those is to make them through this precision fermentation, so making it in a vat. And I know this all sounds like the future, but what I want you to see from these photographs is that this is actually the present. These are happening around us. Singapore is a country that has allowed this to be in production for many years. And you can see that one on the right, the biomilk one. It's a story from 2020, and these companies have been working for quite some time and to produce their products, and they can be commercially available in some markets. This really changes the future for a number of our infant formula products in particular. So interesting, out of the US last month, the White House has just put out a really big report on building the bio workforce of the future. And what they're thinking about here is how do we train and develop people for these new dairy technologies, so for this precision fermentation world. And they've written a very detailed report. I've done a little bit of work here in New Zealand with Muka Tangata, which is the Workforce Development Council for the primary sector, but I can tell you now that we didn't do any work at all in our initial work that was thinking about the growth of biofermentation and what that might mean. So, we can see that if you have enough energy, and energy actually is the biggest barrier to the commercialization of these products at the moment. And so the companies that are doing this really well have put solar on their roofs, have massively reduced their power bill by being able to generate their own distributed energy. And I think we'll see more and more of that, where commercial operations produce their own power as they go. Interesting too is that China's population has peaked. And so as China's population has peaked and is now coming into decline, we need to be looking for other markets. And India is the most likely market that's kind of just in behind China. China has been a great market for our food, particularly dairy and meat, over the last period of time. And most of that has been because of the population growth in China. So as that population starts to fall, their demand for the proteins that provide will probably decline. I hope that it's okay. Maybe, I don't know if one of my other presenters needs to mute, maybe. And then I've got a similar map there to the one that Nigel had, so I probably don't need to go through this, but there's a couple of things that have really changed the dial in terms of food production. One of them is that in 2021, it became cheaper to install and maintain solar or wind than to keep operating coal-fired plants. And what we know is that the price of coal is only going to continue to go up. And it will go up because we will continue to see these environmental pressures and things like climate taxes around the world come into bite on organisations that use coal in their process. So I love that we've got so much of a focus in our region on getting the coal out of our food production, because the cost of coal is really going to increase. And that diagram of Nigel's that showed the switch from coal to other energy sources, I think the thing that will most accelerate that is the price of coal. And as the price of coal comes up and the price of electricity continues to come down, what we'll see is that it becomes no longer economic. So whether they choose to change for climate change reasons or they choose to change for others, we're going to see this acceleration to distributed energy. So this acceleration towards small-scale wind and small-scale solar. I think climate change is here. I'm on the board of a meat company where we take from farms from Gisborne to Masterton, so we were pretty badly hit by these floods in the Hawke's Bay. We'll see that these are not, climate change is not something out into the future, it's something that's here now. And I read with great interest the NIWA report that's been prepared for the Timaru District Council on where things like storm surges are. And I guess what I've been learning as we learn more and more, particularly we learned from the Hawke's Bay, is that it's not just the flooding zones, it's the flooding zones that are combined with the high tide and then big winds and the storm surges. And these are the things that we have to be really thinking about how we plan for and our land use. And so many of our farms are coastal, I mean a lot are inland as well, but we're going to continue to have this major disruption, and we are going to have to see some land use change whether we want to or not. And I love that comment at the beginning that, you know, we'll either change now in a planned way or change will be forced upon us. So this is the NIWA report. I really commend it to you. It's on the Timaru District Council website. and it shows exactly where inundation is expected, but in particular where the high tide surge from seawater inundation, which is the really big issue for us in our region and will be quite a disruptor to our food production if we don't get ahead of it. So one of the last things I just want to mention is that, you know, in New Zealand, we are deferring and have deferred the application of an environmental tax or ETS onto our farming in relation to climate change. But what we're starting to see is a number of our markets saying that if countries don't have those kinds of climate taxes, in a sense, on their food producers, that the markets themselves will impose tariffs on us. So this to me is much, much scarier as a food producer than being in the ETS. So we have a choice. We could either be in the ETS and not have international tariffs, which we can't control, or we can probably stay out of the New Zealand ETS and find ourselves taxed by foreign countries at a rate that's up to them. And so you can see that what they call carbon intensive industries will need to report under the EU regulations, and then we really could open ourselves up to additional tariffs. So I'm just watching that. I'm sorry it's not more cheerful. Where I think things are cheerful is coming back to my very first slide, which is where I looked at who was getting the highest prices. What we saw is that it's a number of attributes. So I'm pretty excited about what the New Zealand dairy industry can do. I'm already excited about what the New Zealand meat industry is doing. And I think what we can see is that as we move into higher and higher attributes and we create the kinds of milk and meat that our customers internationally want, we can continue to get high prices. And not only that, we could really think about what is the benefit of natural and artisan. So what is the benefit to a consumer of having, you know, real milk made in a real cow, eating real forage on a real farm? And those things, if we do them in a way that our customers feel satisfied with, can get us very high prices. So we can think about, you know, some people will go down the organics route, some will go down the regenerative agriculture route, others will go down, you know, GAP 4. I'm on the board of a meat company where we do GAP, we do no GMO, we do antibiotic free, and get a higher price for those. And then on top of that, we do regenerative agriculture and we get a very high price for our skins. And so what I want you to think about if you are a food producer here is, yes, there's all that disruption coming from all of that high-tech food production, and I truly believe it's coming. But at the same time, there is going to be a very well-off customer base in particular that will pay extra for high production quality real food. And we need to be positioning ourselves for that market if we want to really do well in the future. So the last thing I just sort of want to leave with you is that, you know, we should be thinking about where are the threats and what might slow us down, but at the same time, where are the things that we can really capitalize on? And so for me, things like clean and pure and heritage and family farms are all things that I believe that consumers in the future will pay extra for. What we need to be doing is to prepare ourselves for that. But we also have to be very careful that we don't just greenwash that. So I'm going to leave you there, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation later and taking some questions. So let me stop sharing. And I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Melissa. What I find intriguing is that you know where to go to pick up future trends, and the fact that you would go to bodybuilders and discover that they're, you know, feasting on human breast milk, I find mind-boggling. So the fact that you even know where to look is something that is incredibly valuable to us. So I really appreciate you bringing those insights to us.
Thank you.
So our next presenter is Rhys Taylor, who I'm sure many of you know. Rhys is the Climate Change Advisor for Timaru District Council. He's been a great supporter for my work independently. We argue vociferously with each other. We keep each other honest, and I find that incredibly helpful. Rhys did a private trip over to the UK and happened to collect a whole lot of really interesting photos. So Rhys, over to you.
Thank you, Phil. Good evening, everybody. Very good indeed to have another gathering in this sequence of events looking at climate change in South Canterbury. I did indeed. I went to visit my elderly mum, who I hope has passed a lot of good genes to me because she's 98 now. And I really wanted to go to visit her, and my partner came with me retired from school. And we saw a lot of her relatives as well, including some very new additions, and at least one niece who got married on just the right day. So very much a family visit. And I wasn't thinking myself as on a working trip at all. This was strictly to see family. But I had to travel a little bit during that time and did a little bit of public transport travel, and walked, and also drove a car around. But as I travelled, I found that there were images that just kept catching my attention. So I took out my phone and snapped as I travelled. And Troy is finding those now. Upon returning to Britain, I've been based in Aotearoa, New Zealand since 1996. So when I go back to Britain, there's a leap in the changes that I've seen, quite a long interval between the visits. And on this visit, one of the first impressions I had was that as you were walking through Islington, which is where my brother lives, there were a lot of billboards on display from the council. I thought, oh yes, propaganda from the council, keeping the voters happy and so on. But I was curious enough to, on the right-hand side here, to follow the link that appeared on these posters. It went straight to the carbon calculator, which apparently a lot of people have been using. We'll go on from there, Troy, so moving on. And these carbon references were everywhere. Lots of different organisations drawing attention to the options you had as a citizen to reduce your carbon footprint. This one was on, again, on the bus stops. What they're saying is choosing the train instead of the car will cut your carbon footprint by up to 2/3. So there were messages about the carbon impact being the reason for making a behaviour change. And this indicated to me, certainly the newspaper coverage while I was there, only, that there's a lot of debate among the public about the carbon impact of their lifestyle. As I travelled, converted buildings, now roofed with solar panels, wind generation, huge numbers of offshore wind turbines, large numbers of inshore wind turbines were relatively close to humans. They weren't just vanished to distant hilltops. They were in the industrial estates as well. Lots of electric vehicle charging facilities. I looked at the data when I came back, and there are 3 times as many electric chargers per electric vehicle in the UK than there are here. Quite a big difference, a real commitment to providing the facility charge. This was in a very small country town in Oxfordshire. Also, a lot more pedestrian streets and vehicle-free streets, which were full of shoppers. And that should be something that the folks in Wellington should pay attention to. We seem to be worrying about having pedestrian streets in Wellington. These shops were busy. People were very happy to be on foot, and they found places. There were drivers to park their cars and then walk away. And of course, I was a consumer. As I travelled, I had to have occasional snack meals when I was travelling, although my relatives felt very well and put on weight on the trip. But the packaging of items you would buy, even in this case from a small village general store, emphasis that you're not just recycling the pack because recycling is good, but it's part of their mission to become a carbon neutral business. And then when you look at the products themselves, and there's some photographs from the website of the company there, you'll see that alongside the traditional fillings of your sandwiches, like beef and tuna and egg, were an equal number of vegan sandwiches with ingredients which were both natural and processed. But there was a really big emphasis on foodstuffs which were from vegetable sources. And wherever I looked, it became quite entertaining. I would say, oh, here's another. Poster on display at Little Village Hall, Saturday 13th of May, Green Day, whole list of things that we were looking at as a community activity. A cafe in Worcester we stopped at, very proud to announce that they offered free-range food, vegan foods. They were helping the community. They were subscribing to a retailer which was 100% renewable energy and so on. This was a sales message. This was a commitment that was coming across very clearly. And we called in at a rural farm shop, and they were making a great virtue of the fact that they supported local producers, and they were selling meat from producers within about 2 miles away from where they were selling. They wouldn't be selling imported products from New Zealand land, I don't think. They were supporting their local growers. A phrase that occurred on a lot of packaging was responsibly sourced ingredients. This idea of social responsibility and environmental responsibility was very clear. And along with a poster saying, buy this particular brand of ice cream, and I've added the arrow to point it out, Britain's first carbon negative ice cream. You went to a cafe in central London, Pret a Manger, I think it's called, go for the good stuff they're saying, but the small print of the poster says, eating more plant-based food is good news for your carbon footprint. So if you compare it with the impression that you can pick up walking through shopping streets or public places in New Zealand, I suppose they're about, what should we say, 5 years ahead of us. But this was such a clear change from the Britain that I travelled around in on a previous. And then the supermarkets, my last comment about supermarkets. I saw delivery vans travelling around, proudly announcing their electrically powered delivery vans. But Tesco themselves announced their aim to be carbon neutral in 2021 announcements. Their target is to have this by 2035, if not before. They're working with their suppliers and their partners to achieve this. And they're also introducing lots of products for sale which are vegetable based. What they're arguing is that the supermarket chain, being the biggest buyer of New Zealand products, I started researching it, they're saying it's really important what happens in New Zealand and how it feeds into their carbon reduction plans. And they want to make sure that 100% of what they source in terms of fresh produce, meat and dairy is environmentally accredited. That's a very clear message from a pretty big purchaser of products from here. And the other supermarkets are in the same field, so Waitrose and Sainsbury's and so on, they're all saying this, they're all on board. So are we ready for this market change? Are we going to adapt rapidly enough? Are we going to seize it in terms of opportunity, as Melissa was suggesting, or just see it as something we'd rather run away from and hope doesn't happen? It's certainly much more than a fashionable trend, although there are plenty of events which have labels like sustainable market, which are selling all sorts of stuff you probably don't need and labeling it as sustainable, you just buy more. But there's a serious side to this. And the final quote I'm giving on here is actually from that Tesco supermarket website. In its latest review of the science of climate change, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warned of an increased risk of extreme heat waves, droughts, flooding, and a key temperature limit being broken in just over a decade. 30% of global greenhouse emissions come from the food sector. The food industry contributes to climate change and is also vulnerable to it. And that's not a Green's website, that's Tesco Supermarket's website.
Thanks very much, Rhys. I really appreciate that. So this is what's happening at the retail level. So we've heard the commercial stuff, we've heard the future thinking from Melissa. This is what's happening on the ground over in the UK. Now, we can choose to ignore it if we want to, and some people may do that, or we can say, hang on, this looks kind of serious. We are going to take this seriously. I'm just going to bring this a little bit closer to home. I can't imagine any of you go to McDonald's, but just in case you do, when you buy a McDonald's meal to have in the restaurant, you get a little piece of paper on the tray. And this is what McDonald's is saying to their customers. Across our supply chain, by 2030, we expect to prevent approximately 150 million tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions from being released into the atmosphere. That's across their supply chain. They also say, we know beef and dairy farming make up a significant portion of McDonald's global carbon footprint. Our economy here depends on that stuff, meat and dairy. And we might not like what these messages are coming through from McDonald's and Tesco's and others. I don't think we're going to change those companies. So Tesco has not only said they want sustainable products, they want low greenhouse gas emission products, and they recently told our Climate Change Commission that they will measure the emissions from our products on gross emissions, not net emissions. That is a profound statement. What it says is offsetting is off the table. As far as they're concerned, offsetting is a waste of time. If every person on the planet planted a tree, and when those trees were growing strongly, you'd have 8 billion trees, how much of our emissions are they going to capture in days, months, weeks? How long do you think they will capture our emissions? 46 hours. So 8 billion trees will capture 46 hours of global emissions. So offsetting, as far as Tesco is concerned, is off the table. We've got to still do it. It's a good thing to do. But the only thing that's going to make a difference for us is reducing emissions. So we're going to have a 5-minute break. This is just a short one. Stand up, write some questions down, ready for later on. And then we'll come back and listen to Professor Anita Wreford at Lincoln on the right there, and Alan Renwick, who just happens to be her husband. And we'll also be talking about the future for food here. So just 5 minutes, share ideas, write your questions down, and we'll come back to this next set of speakers. Okay, thanks everybody. So I think you'll realise that in the messages we've been receiving tonight, are these high-risk messages, low-risk messages? What is the risk profile for you and your business or your activities? Because it will be different for each one of you. And I think I really like Melissa's final comment about stay curious. Keep asking rather than assuming. Keep thinking, I wonder what new information is coming through. Is that going to change the risks that we're exposed to? Is it going to change the opportunities? Because as I've got dug into more of this climate change work, everything seems to be speeding up. And I think that's what we've got to get our heads around. Because it's not the same as what Grandad did, 50 years ago. It could be different next year. Did you know that on Monday this week, the world experienced the highest average temperature on record? And in June was the highest average global temperature on record. And those records go back to the late 1880s. It's happening now. So we'll move over now to welcome Professor Anita Wreford from Lincoln University, real strengths in agriculture and economics. So Anita, really looking forward to hearing how we're going to do better with our food production. Over to you.
Thanks, Phil. Great. Kia ora koutou, ko Anita Wreford tōku ingoa. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you tonight. And I'm really sorry I'm not there in person. I had hoped to be. It would have worked well with our school holiday plans, but unfortunately COVID struck. So we're back in Lincoln. As Phil mentioned, I work at Lincoln University in the Agribusiness and Economics Research Unit. So I have a background in kind of economic social science, and I look at climate change impacts and think about how we can adapt our systems to cope with them or adjust so that we can continue to grow this great food into the future. As Phil mentioned right at the beginning, I'm also involved in the Deep South National Science Challenge, which is a funding, it's one of 11 national science challenges which fund research to answer questions that are of critical importance for New Zealand. And the Deep South one is on climate change. So today I'm going to share some insights from my own work as well as other research that the Deep South has funded and other work out there to kind of give you a snapshot in quite a short time of how climate change might affect agriculture and horticultural production, and then how we can start to think about adapting to it. So there's a lot to go through, so I'm just picking out some kind of key messages that I think might be of interest. So as Melissa alluded to and others, climate change is here, and hopefully we don't need to debate whether it's actually happening or not. We've seen the impacts of some of these extreme kind of events in our own country and our own agricultural systems over the past couple of years. And increasingly, scientists are able to say that these events are occurring more frequently and more intensely because of climate change. So we have always had them, but the way they're occurring now can be attributed to a changing climate. So some of the work
that we know about is thinking about how the climate will change in different regions of New Zealand. So I've just picked out in a very boring list here what South Canterbury might be expecting. And I think that you're familiar with this through previous reports, but if not, you can find more detail in this Ministry for the Environment report. The key thing I want to emphasise is that they were likely to experience increased variability and extremes. And that's what we're starting to see already now, and these are likely to increase into the future. Some of the research that we have commissioned through Deep South and other organisations has tried to think about, well, what does this mean? What do these climate changes mean for how we use our land? So what will we be able to use different parts of the country for in the future? And so there's been a series of research projects that have tried to map out the suitability for different types of production into the future. And if you are able to see that, you can see there's a website here. Anyone can go into it, and you go through a series of steps and you can find different crops and download information about them. So I've just picked kiwi fruit here as an example, and this is showing the areas that might be suitable, more or less suitable for kiwi fruit by the middle of the century under a high emission scenario. So these are quite high impacts of climate change. So South Canterbury, it's a little tricky to see, I know. It's sort of, there might be some areas, yellow is more suitable, that might be able to grow some kiwi fruit in some regions. Alan will talk a little bit more about how we can use these maps and how useful they actually are, considering other factors, but just to give you an idea of some of the research that is out there. Other work has looked at pasture growth. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find any that was specific for South Canterbury. So this example is for Southland. And pasture growth is one area where we could actually expect to see some opportunities in some regions and some seasons. So the darker colours here, the blue colours, represent increased annual pasture yield. When I showed this to another group, they pointed out most of this is in fieldland, but still you can see that they're actually even, or particularly under higher emission scenarios towards the end of the century, there might be some opportunities for increasing pasture yield. This really varies around the country, and as I said, I wasn't able to find any specifically for South Canterbury, but it is an area that there might be some benefits from higher temperatures and changes in rainfall. Unfortunately, the trouble with these kind of projections is that they don't really consider extreme events like drought. So there's been quite a bit of work looking at drought, how likely droughts are to occur into the future, and there's been work developing drought indices. And so I've just pulled out a couple of figures from a recent report. It's a little tricky again, I know, to pull out South Canterbury, but just if you look on the top two graphs, this is December, January, February, so the summer months, and the left-hand one is mid-century, the right-hand one is the end of the century. Actually, South Canterbury's experience is expected to experience kind of mixed effects around drought. So there are some pockets that might see a reduction in drought under this kind of scenario. And relative to other parts of the country, you could say that actually South Canterbury, or some parts of South Canterbury, are not likely to be quite so badly affected. But there are other hazards, fortunately. Fluvial hazard areas. So this was a study looking at the area of livestock production exposed to river flooding. This was done by NIWA, and it's based on the same kind of method that the report that Melissa presented uses. And you can see that here, South Canterbury, there are areas that are exposed to flood hazard from rivers, and that's not taking into account a sea level rise either, I don't think. So that's something else to consider. There are, of course, a whole range of other impacts that I don't really have time to go into. Heat stress for livestock as well as crops, pests and diseases, storms affecting horticultural production. These are all unfortunately likely to cause big challenges to the way we produce our current food systems. These, of course, have economic impacts, and some of the work that the Deep South funded relatively recently looked at the impact of drought and climate change on farm profits. And this study, which is for sheep and beef, shows that if farmers don't do anything, and that's the critical point that I will move on to, but if we just carry on as we are, then the profit by the end of the century would be around 54% less than in the 2016 to 2018 period under a high climate change future. Interestingly though, if we look at the effect of drought on New Zealand in parallel with the world experiencing drought. So this study looked at a number of scenarios where different countries around the world experienced extreme droughts as well. So this is the kind of global breadbasket failure. When we consider that together with our trading and the way that New Zealand interacts with global markets, actually our producer returns would probably increase. Unfortunately, it would mean higher prices for consumers and be a negative situation for food security, both in New Zealand and globally. But it is important just to remember that we do operate in a trading system, and a lot of the food we produce is exported, as Phil mentioned. But most of what I do actually is thinking about, well, climate change is here, what can we do about it? And the trouble is with climate change, that as with many other challenges, I guess, that there's a high degree of uncertainty despite all this research that we have. We don't know how well we'll do at reducing emissions. We don't know whether we'll be able to keep temperature increases to below 2 degrees or whether we'll go much higher. So it does make making decisions difficult. And a lot of the work that I do is talking to farmers and help them think through, I guess, a short, medium and long-term plan for anticipating the changes. Farmers are obviously used to adapting to changing conditions, whether they're consumer preferences, market changes, or the weather. Climate change is just a little, it's occurring faster and at a greater magnitude than many of these other changes. But obviously farmers are very well equipped in many ways. So some of the work that we do is identifying adaptation options and then thinking about the time frame in which you might implement them. So in the short term, this is based on some work we've done with dairy farmers. There are a lot of things that farmers can do that will give them benefits in the current climate and buy them some time a bit while they wait and see how the climate actually changes, and then start to think about more radical, more significant changes that might require a bit more investment, for example, like irrigation or investing in shelter or herd homes. And then also identifying things in the longer term that are much more transformative, for example, changing land use or different types of production. And thinking in this kind of time frame allows farmers to develop a kind of adaptation pathway where identifying things that occur that can buy you time, can improve your current situation. You're not making big transformative decisions now because you're not quite sure how the future will change or will play out, but you've identified what you need to do so that when the time comes, you're able to implement it. And I think that's what's really key and what's really important about and great about events like this evening is that in order to be able to change land use later on, when the impacts become more intense, we need to have done a whole lot of work in the interim to make sure that we have new breeds available and that farmers know how to access them and have the skills to implement them. So it's thinking about those sequencing timing thresholds is really critical. I just want to also highlight and I guess emphasize what Phil said earlier is that a lot of basically most of the studies that we've seen recently emphasize that early action will be less costly and less painful than delaying action. And this is both for adapting to the impacts and also for reducing emissions, which is more what some of the other speakers have spoken about. So delaying tends to mean that we have to act more quickly when the time comes and have fewer options. So Early action is often best, but as I said before, in regard to the pathways, we don't want to leap into things until we have a better picture of how the climate will actually change. So that is a snapshot from me about impacts and adaptation. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the discussion, and I am going to pass over to Alan now.
If I could just make a comment while Alan's coming on board. As you see, Anita has referred to a lot of independent studies. There's a huge amount of information out there that we can get access to. It's not like nobody's doing anything about this stuff. You've seen what the processors are doing, we see what the researchers are doing. There's a lot going on, and I think most of us just aren't aware of the information that is available to us. ECAN's got information. There's a program called It's Time Canterbury. If you go to the It's Time Canterbury website, there's a lot of information on there as well. So if we ever thought that nobody knew what was going on, yes, a lot of people are doing a heck of a lot of research. The challenge is, how does it specifically relate to you? How does it specifically relate to us? Food matters to all of us. Our agricultural sector matters to all of us because they produce our food. It's not the agriculturalists out there and the townies in here. Food is important to all of us, so it's our issue we need to work on. So over to Alan Renwick. I'll let you introduce yourself there, Alan. Thank you.
Good evening. Thanks, Phil. Again, I'd extend my apology for not being able to be with you today. As I said, we were hoping to be there. I'd just like to, I guess, follow on a bit from Anita's talk, but really, I guess, focus down on what this might mean in terms of food production, and really think about some of the opportunities and challenges for food production and diversifying our food production as a response to climate change. So I first want to talk a bit about how land use might change and pressures on our land use. But then I want to think a little bit more, just using a couple of potential examples, thinking about alternative proteins and thinking about perhaps some of the opportunities and challenges for diversifying our food production in a sense to make a more resilient food sector. So if we think about what diversification for climate change may look like, I know we've been talking a lot about adaptation today, but I think there's also the mitigation side that we need to think about, and the contribution that agriculture can make to mitigating our emissions. And so if we're thinking about it at the landscape or farm level, then really we've been talking about mitigation. We've sort of can talk about alternative approaches to current land use enterprises, or as Nigel was saying, I guess, alternative approaches to the way we process our traditional products, and the move from coal-fired to electric or renewable would be examples of that as well. But also, and where I guess I've spent a lot of my last 5 or 6 years, really thinking a bit more about moving away, I guess, potentially from our traditional livestock based systems in New Zealand, because I think there's some evidence that we can go so far down the way with reducing emissions in our current systems by improving efficiency, adopting new technologies, etc. But really, if we're going to go have a transformation in our land use, we do need to think about alternative enterprises. And so there might be some substitution, for example, crops or livestock, but also integration, more crops and livestock together. And I think a really key issue, and I'll come back to this, is that we really need to think about the system as a whole. And I was showed perhaps a lot of the work kind of thinks about individual enterprises, but really it's how they fit together at the farm level in a system that is important. But when we come to think about adaptation, then I guess we can think about adoption of land use enterprises that increase the resilience of farm business to climatic events. And at the farm level, again, other forms of farm and non-farm business diversification that may also increase our resilience. And this little graph here is maybe a little bit hard to see, but what this was is a bit of work that we did for MPI as part of a SLEMAC project. And what we were looking at here is what would happen if we substituted intensive livestock production with promising crop enterprises, i.e. lower greenhouse gas emitting enterprises. And what we could see on paper, I don't know if this is there for you, we can see here that potentially on this side it's profitability. So these promising enterprises could actually increase our levels of profitability. And on here, we can see some greenhouse gas reductions as well. So potentially, on paper at least, we could see opportunities to increase profitability and reduce emissions, which would be a win-win situation for us. But of course, it's a long way from our office and our computers to the reality at the farm level and on the ground there. One of the things I guess I would say, if we're thinking about an overall resilient food sector, and I tend to come at it from the farm side of things, I would suggest that ideally the most resilient landscapes, most resilient farm sectors are diversified, and we have diversified businesses and landscapes. Different enterprises in there probably will increase our resilience. And now there's a lot of ways we can get to diversified landscape, and I'm not going to go through all these options here, but there's a range of ways that we can get this sort of mosaic into our landscape, which hopefully will form the basis of resilience at the farm scale. And if we are thinking about substitution and we are thinking about alternative crops, then clearly there's a whole range of products that can be grown. And again, this is work that we did earlier as part of the SLEMAP project, really trying to identify promising enterprises that could be, expand within New Zealand and perhaps substitute in where livestock production is. And the ones in blue highlighted here were the ones that we took forward. But really the point I'm trying to get over here, I think, is, again, on paper, there's a whole wide range of enterprises that could be brought into our farm systems that could help reduce our emissions, could help us more resilient to some of the changes that are going on. And again, when we were looking at this, there's a whole lot of drivers that might make these more attractive, growth in demand from Asia. They might be premium products. They might be have health benefits. They might be that New Zealand is recognised for these things. So there's a lot of drivers there, which potentially could make these enterprises particularly attractive. But I think the challenge is, again, this is on a paper exercise, but really, we need to think about whether they're going to be adopted and what's going to happen to our systems if we do adopt them. And Anita kind of highlighted a sort of graph a bit like this before. A lot of work's being done looking at suitability of land use and potential in different areas. Again, Anita was showing this into with climate change into the future. This one is just looking at suitability now. But the point I would make again is, just about because the land is suitable, it doesn't mean it's relevant or right to change. Clearly I'm an economist, there's a lot of issues in here about whether it's viable to change, the costs, the returns, etc. in it. So again, whilst a lot of work and suitability does give us an indication about whether the crops could be brought into our systems here, clearly that's not telling us the whole story about whether they should be and the impact of doing this. Now, some of the work that Anita referred to in Whitiora and the data supermarket that our Land and Water have put up have gone beyond suitability to think about profitability of these crops. So again, really all I'm trying to show here is that in theory, we can grow many crops and they could be profitable. And it's not just crops, it could be sheep dairy, goats or whatever as well. And again, just highlighting, again, it's a little tricky to pick out South Canterbury in these sort of national maps, but hopefully you can get an idea. So here we have blueberries, maybe onions, peas, cherries, I put avocados at the end here. I mean, clearly there's not much opportunity for avocados down here at the moment, but remember, these are profitability at the moment. And as Anita will point out, we need to think about how the climate's going to change and the profitability of these crops going forward. But again, I guess the point I'm saying is, we could grow many crops. They could be profitable, but we really do need to think about how this fits into the value chain, the infrastructure that we need for this, whether the market demand is going to be there, how is this going to work with climate change, and so on. So there's many issues that we need to think about beyond this. And one of the things we find from a lot of the work that we were doing is, the difficulty is that we could identify a lot of potential enterprises that could, in a sense, be substituted for perhaps some of the high emitting sectors such as dairy. But what we tended to find is very hard to find things that could be adopted at scale, that have the market benefits of dairy, the financial benefits of dairy. We know how to produce dairy in New Zealand. We have strong knowledge. There are a lot of alternatives perhaps that have environmental benefits or social benefits or help us meet regulation. And again, this is kind of the challenge when we're thinking about our future land uses, is that, we definitely, it's tricky to find about land use competition, about getting space for these other enterprises in our current land use, because at the end of the day, it's a economic decision about what people are going to grow, and it's driven by the markets in this situation. And on that note, I guess it's kind of follows up a bit from what Melissa and Nigel was saying. Nigel was saying about the large proportion of exports that the region accounts for. So really, we're sitting here talking about our food systems and we're talking about land use in South Canterbury, but actually we're not the ones who are really controlling that, to me. So who's deciding what is produced in South Canterbury? It's those markets where that's getting exported, where we're selling to. And Nigel showed a nice graph there, I thought, of where the exports are going through from China, Europe, Indonesia, or wherever it may be, Australia, of course. And that was interesting. Melissa was pointing out about the growth in demand from India. Maybe that will offset some of this population change issues going on in China. But we have to, in a sense, the decisions about land use are driven by the markets, and the markets are driven by our customers, and they're not necessarily those in New Zealand. So that's an important factor to me about when we're thinking about a resilient food system. We have to bear in mind this relationship we have with trade and what they're demanding on their market. And Melissa mentioned the issue about, as those markets change, if it get harder to get into Europe because of their view about dealing with carbon offsets, carbon taxes, these sorts of things will be important in that way. So I've kind of focused there really on land use and changes, but clearly, and the point I think very clearly from Nigel's statement is, we need to think about the value chain as a whole, and our processes and the market right through from farm right through to fork. So to highlight, I think, some of the opportunities and challenges that might come in these alternatives, I want to just sort of focus on a couple of examples, really, or 3 examples, thinking about potential for oats for oat milk as an example, peas for pea protein, chestnuts for chestnut flour in terms of gluten-free. And I'm really just using these. They could be, again, any of those products I looked at before, the whole range of crops and enterprises. But really, I'm just taking these, partly because we've done some work on these. But really, I think they do highlight some of the challenges for a region or for New Zealand as a whole in diversifying our food system to some extent. So what we can see in the alternative protein market, and again, Melissa highlighted going one stage further and was talking about fermentation and cultured and things like this. But if we think about, I guess, an intermediate step, which is still, I guess, produced farm-based produced products, clearly what we see is that globally there's been 4 main drivers for these alternative proteins or gluten-free products as well. So consumer preferences driven by health and lifestyle factors. We've got environmental awareness. We've got potentially new products coming in through research development. And we've also got governments who are pushing opportunities in these areas as well. And so what we can see from this, and the work that we did highlighted, very positive global growth in demand for these alternatives, which would seem to suggest opportunities for regions such as South Canterbury or countries such as New Zealand in taking these up. And so we can see high growth rates, annual growth rates predicted into the future globally for many of the products that would fit into these areas. But of course, we should, a tale of caution here is, in special meat analogues, there has been quite a headwind going on in that area at the moment, and demand hasn't grown as expected, and a number of these alternative meat companies are struggling at the moment. But that aside, I think we could, kind of highlight that there's been strong global demand in this area. But of course, as we're highlighting, really, we're talking about export and export markets and determining what's going to go on in the region to a large extent. We also need to think that we're competing in these markets at a global level. So what's happening in terms of global supply? Sort of interestingly, if we look at these alternative protein markets, I think what we can see is compared to our traditional chains, which are very, very concentrated, with the Tysons, the JBS, etc., the big milk companies who really dominate the whole market. In these sort of alternative, because I guess they're relatively new, we see that these chains are what we, I guess, to say were more fragmented compared to traditional value chains. There's a lot more local competition in here, a lot more different sort of companies in it. But that said, we can definitely see signs that these are moving in the same direction as our more traditional changes. If we look at companies like Oatly, which is the largest oat milk producer, the bottom picture here shows the new factory that they're aiming to build in the UK. And I think that's at a scale of producing 450 million litres of oat milk a year in there. And if we look up here, this is Wreford's new factory in Canada to produce pea protein. And I think this is going to be the largest in the world and will produce 125,000 tonnes of pea protein a year. So what we're seeing is this growth, big economies of scale coming in here, economies of production. And the market is becoming increasingly contested with international and national players. And I think one of the challenges then is, as the scale grows, do these alternatives, which we saw as kind of niche before with potentially higher prices and margins, do they actually just become commodities? And that would be a threat to us thinking about developing it in New Zealand. Also, I think the point that has been made a couple of times already tonight is, a lot of traditional livestock protein companies are aware of what's going on. It's kind of like the stagecoach investing in the trains or the trains investing in the planes as they come along. There's a realization that these things are here to stay, and we can see that a large number of livestock protein companies have been investing in one way. So they've been working, I would say, in 3 ways. They've been developing their own plant-based products. Wonder Pea drink by Nestle here, or we can see here, Arla have produced a plant-based Lurpak, or we see here that Avonmore, which is a big Irish processor, are producing their oat milks here. Or they're engaging in joint ventures with other companies, or they're investing in startups themselves. And Tyson Foods' initial investment in Beyond Meat, obviously a cultured meat company there, although they did sell it originally, was an example. But also we can kind of see that they've moved into hybrid situations as well. So really, all that was really getting us to the point where does New Zealand and South Canterbury fit in these sorts of emerging opportunities? We've got strong global demand, we've got increasingly competitive global market, but where, in a sense, can we fit in? And I think the issue for me is that we need to think about how this fits into our whole value chain and our supply chain for it. So where are we in terms of raw materials, about the products that are made? What about our processing capacity and opportunities? And so really here we're kind of thinking about a change from, from the oat milk through to delivering it, from pea protein, the cultivation, drying, isolating the protein, packaging, delivering, etc., and thinking about how New Zealand fits through this value chain. Now, clearly, we produce the raw materials. We've got suitable areas for oat production, pea production, and we can see here our national production over a period of time. But we can see, whilst we have suitable conditions, and there's quite a large area that's suitable for this, we have had a declining, area of peas. Oats have been pretty static. Again, they're struggling at the moment to compete with alternative land uses. But we can see in South Canterbury here, with Timaru here, our major players in the country in both oats and sort of more importantly, I guess, in pea production. So we've got the raw materials. New Zealand can produce the raw materials. So the question is, can we make it profitable to do so? And we can see in terms of the final products, there's a number here. Here's one's just available in a supermarket in Christchurch last July. Clearly, there's a number here, a number from New Zealand, but also we are competing, as I said, internationally with a number from across. And we can see with the price levels here, we know what the final price and the market and the point is going to be. I mean, interestingly, if we look at those that are branded New Zealand, we have the sort of story about where we are in terms of our value chain. So if I haven't listed the names here, I've maintained the identity, but really there's only one product, boring oat milk, that actually is grown, products grown in New Zealand, the oats, the processing occurs in New Zealand, and the final product is in New Zealand. We've got others that are grown and processed in Finland, some grown in New Zealand, sent to Sweden and then come back to New Zealand. And then we've got those grown and processed in the UK and coming back to New Zealand. All of these would claim to be New Zealand products. And again, that might be a discussion with the challenges of getting that premium for New Zealand that we might look later. In terms of pea protein, again, really all I want to say here is all the pea protein products that are available in New Zealand are made with imported pea protein. So even those that claim to be New Zealand products, they are based on imported pea protein. So here we have the protein isolates here, protein products, but also we have a small number of companies making the meat analogues, nothing naughty, sun-fed, off-piste, etc., but entirely reliant on imported. And that's because we haven't got the capacity yet. So we have small scale oat processing at the moment, which is basically a converted apple press in the North Island. We have no commercial scale pea protein plant, no commercial scale chestnut flour production. So we are lacking that key part of the chain there. Of course, this may be about to change with the oat milk factory being developed in Southland, and we see a 60 million litre capacity being talked about, maybe going up to 80. But still, really, that's only about 1,800 hectares, given the small proportion of oats that make the final product. And we're looking at that in comparison with a 450 million Oatly plant in the UK, for example. There's been feasibility done around pea protein, potentially a 15,000 tonne seen as viable, 4,300 hectares that would relate to. But again, compared to a 125,000 tonne plant in Canada, we can see we may have issues with economies of scale in this slide. Another opportunity may come for us in terms of, again, we've highlighted about existing protein companies globally moving into alternatives, but we can see that in New Zealand as well, with Fonterra announcing its movement into startup companies, Royal DSM, Motif Ingredients, Silver Fern Farms have been thinking about meat plant hybrids, and again, what potentially these alternatives could link into these sophisticated chains. And I think Nigel was saying again about putting different products through our processing plants. So there may be some opportunities there. And these protein companies could benefit from the lower environmental footprint associated with these alternatives to lower their overall footprint as they're under pressure to do so from customers and government, etc. So really the questions for New Zealand and for, I guess, the region is, can we compete? And how can we return the value be returned to growers to encourage them to produce these crops? So the question is about, can we have grower groups? Can the growers invest in processing? Do we need to actually move into developing brands in these areas? And again, I haven't talked about it too much today, but again, what's the role for the public sector, the private sector, public-private relationships in there? And I've sort of just drawn this little graph off the top of my head, really thinking about in terms of the rewards available to growers and the region, in a sense we could just stay as suppliers, and that would be relatively low investment risk, but also potentially low reward. We can move into the processing area in here, either in partnership or grower owned. Investment risk obviously increases, but so does potential reward. And then we can move into brand ownership, which can also increase our situation, increase profitability potential, but also investment and risk. So really the question in here, and I noticed there was a lot of talk about collaboration as well. Really the point is, I think if we're going to take most out of these opportunities, then really we're going to need collaboration between growers, collaboration between processors and growers, brands, growers, processors, etc., in terms of developing these markets and getting it. But the key thing then is, as we moment, peas are struggling to compete with other land uses, oats are, that in order to increase production of these alternatives, in order for them to move into other areas where maybe higher emission products are being grown at the moment, then clearly we're going to need premiums. But to achieve premiums is going to be challenging, as we're saying, in this global market. And I kind of call this the idea about free ceilings. And it's not just on the products I'm talking about, but really in the sense of most alternative products that we may think that could come into our supply chain. The first ceiling really is, if we think about the costs of growing, is any benefit to farmers here, is the potential that actually processors and others can simply use imported raw materials. So this could be imported peas, it could be imported oats in the examples, imported chestnuts in the examples I'm looking at, okay? Now, the point is, if we were going to pay a premium for domestic production in this case, then that actually is going to add to a cost which we're going to start off with processing. So then even if the processing costs were similar in New Zealand as to others, and I'm saying that's going to be challenging because of economies of scale, then our overall costs are going to be higher because we've got the premium here. And then if we need a premium for processors as well, we need to add that onto it. And of course, again, the issue is here, we can import the processed product, pea isolate, oat milk or whatever it is, into New Zealand. So that's going to set a bit of a ceiling. Again, if we want a premium, that's going to then add the cost to those manufacturing the final product. And again, even if their costs are the same as other countries, we are going to end up now, especially if they want a premium too, with products that are significantly higher priced than imported final products. So we're going to say, I guess we're arguing here, to get that premium, to generate the returns, we're going to need a significantly higher final product than perhaps value than for other alternative imported products. So really, what I guess I kind of need to conclude there is, in terms of these alternatives, we're going to struggle to compete in purely economic terms with these main competitors in global markets. These very large scale producing regions, large production, processing factories, etc. And even these large-scale ones are struggling to make margins. Oatly is really struggling to make profitability, and it's the largest oat company in the world. They're only making a margin of about under 10% on their products. So if they're struggling, and we're going to be not at that scale, we're going to struggle. And that's for New Zealand, but potentially also we're thinking about our regional advantages in this. And clearly where I think what this then leads us to think is, where's New Zealand been successful with these alternatives? It tends to be where we have the intellectual property, i.e., kiwi fruit, we always come back to these really, or maybe some other advantages around wine and apples, etc. We're not going to compete in these markets on the basis of scale, of economies, of pure price as well. We need something else for our alternatives. And I think this kind of comes to the point that Melissa sort of ended with. I mean, she was talking about the whole products and the value. Really it's going to be around differentiation, product innovation, and nation or even region branding. I mean, interestingly, when Troy, I think, was talking about, his images from the UK, and clearly, obviously, I'm from the UK as well. Region, local is very important there. In New Zealand, because of our size and things, we don't talk so much about region branding. I think it's harder for us to do that. But really, the way we're going to move into these alternatives is I think we're going to have to try and get that premium. And these are the challenges for us in how we do that, because we need, in a sense, for a resilient food sector, we need these alternatives, but we need it to be viable for those when they're choosing what crops to produce, what crops to process, etc. To get this diversified landscape that we want in terms of, and I guess I'm using landscape here in terms of diversified food businesses, as well as the farm sector producing what we need, then there are going to be some challenges with us in, as saying, moving away from our traditional enterprises as such. Thanks very much. That's all I wanted to say tonight.
Thanks very much, Alan. Well, it's not particularly simple, is it? And I think the messages that have been coming through is it's the whole chain, the whole food chain we need to look at. We might be able to grow the best pumpkins in the world, but if we can't sell them, it's not going to work all that well. And so again, with Alan, he had links to a lot of useful information that will now be on the Timaru District Council website. One of the things none of the speakers have mentioned, which perhaps I would like to make my first question for after the break, is climate refugees. So we've been told that by about 2030, there'll be around 2 billion climate refugees coming from either side of the equator. And Singapore happens to be on the equator, and that's where a lot of the precision fermentation businesses are. So I would ask our speakers, should we be attracting those precision fermentation companies to Washtenae under Nigel's good care, and then our local farmers growing the feedstock for those precision manufactured companies? So that would be driven by climate change driving, climate refugees, which is sort of sounds like it's got nothing to do with food, but it just might. So look, can we take about 15 minutes? There's some food outside, there's some drinks, cold drinks, hot drinks. Help yourself to a bit of that, come back within about 15 minutes. You've got your question slips. If you could write questions down, Rhys will sort some out and we'll fire them up through to our speakers when you get back. So 15 minutes, we'll see you back in here. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and we'll pick up again. So, Melissa, if we come to you, the question relates to the high-value milk products, whole milk products in America. The question is, are you suggesting that we transport milk, including 89% water, across the world, and with associated transport costs and carbon footprint? The cost has been why we don't export whole milk, only milk products and milk powder. So there's a challenge for you, Melissa.
Great question. And I would actually just like to say, I do support ruminant agriculture. And as I said, like I work with Dairy NZ. I was on the board of Beef and Lamb, and I'm on the board of a meat company. I believe that there is a role, and I hope that I got that across in my final slide, that there is a role, an ongoing role for ruminant agriculture in New Zealand and in the rest of the world. And so, yeah, I can see how people might have taken that I'm suggesting we put whole milk across the world. I don't mean it like that. I guess I just took that as an example because trying to compare cheeses and things, which is actually where the biggest growth in milk consumption has come from, is the growth of cheese consumption globally. It just got a bit complicated. I was worried I couldn't get it all across in a really short period of time. So I think that milk and milk products have a place. I guess I have some concerns, and this is this area of like, if we can keep an eye on the headwinds that are coming at us, we can turn them into tailwinds. And so, where I see that, I really want to make sure that farmers stay in business, and I want to make sure that farmers are able to make a good living. And so one of my real concerns is that if we end up competing with commodified products, and Alan mentioned this a bit as well as Anita, that if we compete with commodified products, we end up with world markets forcing our prices down, and that means that the return to our farmers and our communities goes down over time, and I don't want to see that. So I believe that if we want to continue to compete, the way we do that is to produce really high value products that give us the best possible return right back to the farmer. And so, yeah, whole milk is not it, but we are going to have to think quite differently about some of the milk products that we produce and what form they take.
Okay, so thanks for that. So obviously the freight cost is a key part of the whole question. Yep. Another question has come through. Are we stuck in trying to convince people, consumers, processors, producers to do things differently rather than working with the early adopters to get the runs on the board and bring the fence sitters back on the journey? So should we be working with the early adopters? So who will I start with? Who would like that? Alan, is that something? Oh, sorry, Melissa. Okay, Melissa, you go first on that.
Look, I can tell you now that, having worked in the industry a very long time, we can try and convince people, but actually what we know is that the early adopters start doing stuff. One of the hardest things in a rural community is when you're the first person to do something. Your neighbours will pile and tell you you're a lazy farmer or that you're an idiot, or there's all kinds of stuff that goes down. And so we have to work with a few courageous people that try some stuff out. Sometimes they fail, sometimes they succeed. But I can tell you, like, I work with all these different, farm groups, whether it's grasshoppers or, there are these like farm community groups that get together and they go and see who are the most profitable farms in the neighbourhood, and they know who they are. And if they turn out to be some of those early adopters, pretty much everyone in that community starts to follow them. So, I guess I've stopped wasting my time trying to convince everybody. I want to work with those early adopters to try and make them more profitable and make better products, and then other people will follow. That's my 10 cents worth. I'll get off now.
Thanks, Melissa. I remember when I worked at Lincoln, we were asked, how do you get a farmer to change? And the answer was get his neighbour to change first. Yeah. And I think there's still quite a lot of merit on that. Yeah. So who else would like to pick up on that question of early adopter?
I think following on from that, I've got a master's student at the moment who's doing their work looking at the role of information in changing production and everything. And I think what she's finding very strongly is that still holds. Peer-to-peer, what's going on, they talk to each other. What's different now is that they're doing it through WhatsApp. They're doing it through social media channels. They're doing it through Quorum Sense. They're talking to each other. So again, I think what is clear is, get those who are innovating. Others will follow, and I think that's a really interesting. The difference now, it's a digital thing. They're not necessarily doing it with their next door neighbor over the fence. They're doing it with the community, which can be spatially distributed throughout the globe, actually, in some of these instances. So, but I think that's right. We should never underestimate the power of peer-to-peer. But again, that might emphasize in Melissa again is the point is, you want the influencers to be the ones who are being innovative and being, who are doing well with the new things, and not just having echo chambers there, perhaps. Yeah.
And I think actually reflecting on Roger's point about the animal production industry, nobody is telling the animal production industry to do it differently. If some innovators want to do stuff differently, let them get on with it. And the other farmers can keep doing what they're doing, and we see, how it plays out.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, just following up on that, sorry, that last point, and I guess, I don't think anyone here, well, from my interpretation, no one here was attacking the animal industry. I think what we're trying to emphasize, and the work that I've been doing while I've been here just happens to be on alternative enterprises and this view of a diversified landscape. We're just arguing we feel that may be more resilient. Is no attack particularly on particular enterprises or anything. I think generally, globally, the understanding is diversified landscapes produce the biggest benefits for us overall. And so thinking about how we might get more diversified landscapes is really all we're looking at here, I think.
Thank you. Okay. And Anita or Nigel, got any further comments on working with early adopters? Okay,
I mean, I just agree, with Melissa and Alan in the adaptation space where also, there are lots of people trying different things, and we've actually just got a new research project which is trying to document some of the practices that farmers have made over the years in terms of adapting to variability. And so that there's, I guess, resources that farmers can trust and see what this does to yields, what it does to profits, how difficult it is, and how likely it's going to continue to be effective into the future. So yeah, that's my contribution.
Thanks very much. Nigel, nothing from that. Okay. Another question then, how do we navigate a global environment where a few larger companies are controlling the prices of food, the availability, the nutrient density of food, if we're a small producer? I mean, locally, two supermarkets control produce prices, similarly internationally. So how do we enable access to fresh fruit and nutrient variety locally? Do we need protection for local food supply? Anybody want to pick that up?
I could perhaps start. Actually, 11 years ago now, I spoke to the Oxford Farming Conference, and the title of the conference was really about power in global agriculture. And I think it really was just highlighting those things about how a small number of very large firms completely dominate our food supply chain. And and I thought the supermarket power in the UK was quite bad until I moved to New Zealand, and I realised I think we have perhaps the most concentrated supply chain virtually globally in terms of the dominance of those two supermarkets. And it does, and it absolutely does create challenges for small scale. And again, I think our distributed population also creates difficulty for having viable small scale markets for those who want to produce. And yes, we can do it at a very niche and a very small scale, but if you make any size in your business in New Zealand, then you're going to have to deal with either exporters or the supermarkets, and that is a challenge. They are the gatekeepers to the consumers and to our markets, and but that's not to say they can't be circumvented. If you listen to I've forgotten his name, the fossil fuel free cherry farmer from Otago who speaks quite a lot, he's been very much pushing the direct marketing to consumers. I mean, again, this is where the digital age can help, and you can begin then to have that very short interaction, relationship with your consumers. And his aim is to get at least 10 or 15% of his crop direct to consumers that way, and then you can begin to build up and maybe avoid some of those problems with those gatekeepers.
Thank you. Melissa, you look like you want to say something.
Oh, I was going to say Mike Casey is his name. And I've written quite a bit about him in terms of he's got the first Monarch electric tractor in New Zealand, which is pretty interesting. I'm going down to see it. But I think there were sort of two questions there, and the one that concerns me, there's two. So there's one about our paths to market. So Atkins Ranch, which I'm on the board of, we sell primarily through Whole Foods in the US, and then we work quite hard to make sure that we have some other customers, and it is hard. And I think it's just one of the things you have to accept when you're a global food producer, is that those big companies will dominate. You can try and do some direct to consumer, and many companies are, and it is easier than ever before, but it's also in a way getting more and more expensive, because whether you have to go through Google or you go through Facebook, or how you get to those customers is actually harder now in some ways than it probably was 4 or 5 years ago. The second question is really to me about food security for our own people. And that one, I know there's been a lot of work done on whether we need a food strategy for New Zealand. I didn't really think it was important at the beginning, but certainly the more that I think about it, the more I think we have to think about this double piece where we get the highest prices by exporting, but it's crazy to be a food producing country where we have food poverty. So, I don't know the answer to it, but I really do think that we need to put some really big brains onto it. There's two questions.
Thanks for that. Any other comments? Okay, the next question. The night's been focused fairly heavily on the monetary and financial resilience, because we have been talking, commercial scale. Perhaps haven't looked at the environmental side or environmental resilience. And so the question is, how can we create a food system which is on a human scale, i.e. eating local food, having less of the produce imported, international trade and so on, caring for the local ecology to preserve local health and well-being? Wouldn't these be really important aspects of the truly local food resilience? Comment on that? I mean, I guess this is, the question is perhaps looking more at domestic food consumption as distinct from the commercial food chain. But again, how does that commercial food chain, address the local need?
I think we have challenges in New Zealand in that concept, I think, just because of the nature of, we're an outlier in the world, We're one of the few countries, most countries would consume 90% of what they produce and maybe export 10%, and we're the other way round. And if you look at some of the more agroecological work and things like that, I guess their ideal is this idea, exactly what you say, a locally embedded agroecological agricultural sector that sort of serves its region and its people and things. But I think the challenge for us is simply this: that is such a small part of what we produce. We could have those systems, but we would have, we would end up with obviously a much smaller scale agricultural sector. What do we do with all this other land? We're just in a very unusual situation in New Zealand. If you're in the UK or somewhere else, you can, when I was working in Scotland, they had this thing called the Fife diet, where they were promoting the guy lived for a year just consuming food that could be produced in Fife, which was kind of interesting. He lasted 1 day before he had to go to coffee. That was his sort of main area. But again, I understand the emotion, and strengthening this local, I think is great, but I can't see how it can address the challenges facing particularly in New Zealand agriculture. That would be my only concern.
Yes, and I think tonight we were looking more at that larger scale commercial production. And I think there's a lot of initiatives, anything from community gardens to there's a company, a group up in Wellington, what do they call them? Common Unity. And, they have quite a lot of people involved in growing food. There's a food group that I'm linking to in the UK, and it's essentially a cooperative, and they've got something like 500 hectares of communally grown food. So they're not even attempting to be part of a commercial network. It's in parallel with, in addition to the commercial processes. So any other comments from our panel, including Nigel and Rhys?
We've got a question that came in for Nigel in this.
Question for Nigel.
Question for Nigel.
I mean, I just agree with what Alan said, and I think why I was reluctant to kind of jump in initially is that we are so dependent as a country for our wealth on the export of food. And so, you know, we've kind of heard for a long time that like agriculture is a sunset industry and so on, but it doesn't matter how you cut it, agriculture and food are still our biggest exports. And so, you know, for us to decide that we would not export food would be a massive change to New Zealand's wealth. And, you know, we would have to replace that with something else. And so, you know, I guess like I would like to see more biodiversity on our farms, and certainly at Beef and Lamb, we've done a lot of work on biodiversity. And I think that, you know, we will see changes to the way that we farm. But I'd be very reluctant to be thinking about a purely local play. We just don't have another industry at this point that would provide jobs and wealth and taxes that would support the way that New Zealanders want to live. And I think that's really one of our big challenges.
And I think that's important. It's not just the success of our agricultural industry, it's the well-being of all of us is dependent on, you know, effective food production. And that's why we're calling this food resilience, not agricultural resilience. It's food, it's all of us affected. So I've got a question here for Nigel. Can you comment on plans for adapting and mitigating risk of coastal or flood inundation for wash strike, given the large amount of food processing going on there?
Look, I think it's a really, sorry, I'm back up here. It is a really good question, and you know, the modelling, and I think Melissa showed some of the models up on before as well. It is front of mind of those food processes out there, and I think the thing is, you know, each will have a different take on their approach to that. But the beauty, I suppose, with this part of the country is the availability. The reason these entities are here are those enablers right across the board, whether it's people, whether it's water, whether it's energy. So the ability for them to transition or adapt and take on board that approach of inundation in a timely manner is really up to them individually. The one point I do want to make and come back to is something that Melissa said earlier on, and it comes through in my day job, whether it's the tourism sector or whether it's the business and industry sector, and that is playing to your strengths. You know, Melissa spoke before about pure and genuine, authentic, and that sort of thing. Like New Zealand is a little country at the bottom of the world. You know, we're not going to match the scale of some of the change in consumer demand. You know, the oat milk factory down Southland's great, but the scale, the size of the monolith that is being built in Canada is significant. You know, what we can play to is those strengths, being genuine, being authentic, and that provenance of the food and that value add that we can, you know, that discerning consumer now globally is looking for something different. They want to know where it's come from, what it looks like, etc. So to me, that's and to a lot of the industries that we speak to locally, that's the strength and the grunt, I suppose, that we can bring to this this changing environment as we step forward. So don't try and be something that you think people want you to be. Play to your strengths and really amplify that. So thank you.
Thanks very much. So we've got a comment on scaling up from 4.5 million litres of oat milk per year to 12 million litres of cow milk per day. I mean, it's a massive change. And so the question is, is it even conceivable that we can scale up oat milk or alternative milks to the scale and volume that we currently have from the dairy industry?
I'm going to jump in and just ask, why would we? And I guess the question for that is that I feel like we're in danger, even with our dairy, of highly commoditizing it. We keep asking about how we continue to produce at high volumes, and this is part of why I'm really interested in why don't we focus on higher prices instead. And so, you know, I'm not sure, like, so for me, I don't know that the question is the right question to be asking. It's sort of a question to be asking from the Industrial Revolution point of view or something, not from a sustainability point of view. So, I mean, no, but then why would we?
Okay, any other comments? I see Anita's taking the easy option of nodding.
No, I do just agree. And I guess the point is with all of these, well, when I think about climate change, but for all of these questions, it's not an either or. It's trying lots of different things to make the puzzle or complete the puzzle. And so I agree with Melissa, we wouldn't be trying to replace all dairy with oat milk, but it could be part of the picture.
Okay. Well, thanks for that. We're pretty much at the end of time, and I've got just one more little presentation I need to make. While you're still online, I'd very much like to thank you for your contributions to all 5 speakers. It's been incredibly informative. You've given us some challenging ideas. We're not comfortable with all of them. Some people are comfortable with some ideas and not others. And I think that is the start of, or part of, the journey that we are on. And I think it was Melissa at one point, as you said in the answer to this last question, not everybody's going to suddenly shift to some new one answer to all our problems. It's going to be multiple solutions in many different ways, and we don't even know how some of those different ways are going to play out. And I guess I admire the early adopters and innovators who are trying different things, tapping into the research of our speakers tonight and just saying, I wonder if this will work, and if it doesn't, being prepared to accept the cost and try again. And I think that's one of the strengths we've got down in South Canterbury. People try stuff, and I think we will discover new pathways, but those pathways aren't quite clear just yet. So I just want to do one quick presentation, one slide. Troy, if you could just flick over to the final slide. And this is a concept called a South Canterbury Climate Trust. The reason I'm raising this is that up till now, since about August last year, I've been leading the work on the climate change strategy. As you've seen tonight, just one topic of commercial food resilience is bigger than any one person can handle. And if we look at coastal inundation at 2 of our settlements, Wreford and Rangitata, the issues there are legion. There's privately owned houses, there's leased houses, there's people who are ready to leave, the people who want to stay, there's people who want compensation, people who don't, where are they going to shift to? And a lot of people don't even live there, they live in the North Island because these are holiday homes. So there's another issue that's incredibly complex. If we look at the domestic food supply, how are we going to keep good food for ourselves? That's another big problem. So what I'm proposing is that essentially replace me with what I'm calling a South Canterbury Climate Trust. And it's going to involve everybody. It's going to continue doing what I'm doing, only it's going to be a bit more formally constituted with a few more people involved. And what we need to do, this trust needs to independently, objectively answer these questions. What are the climate change impacts likely in South Canterbury? Now, there's a lot of information. A lot of it isn't really locally specific to your farm, to your valley, to your catchment. So we need more information on that. Which are the big impacts? We can throw our hands up and say, oh, it's going to be flooding. Yeah, how big is the flooding? Is it really an impact on everybody or just a few people? Who and what will be impacted? How much? What actions will increase our resilience? Maybe a bit of coastal inundation is a good thing, because in America, half the seafood harvest comes from coastal lagoons. So maybe we need to say, hey, let this area flood, make a lagoon, grow, I don't know, whatever you grow in a lagoon. Who needs to work together? So if we're going to address commercial food resilience, who are all the players that need to be around the table at the same time, sharing ideas? And Nigel's doing some superb work on the processor side. I know he's talking to the grower industry, grower side, but on all these other topics, we need to work together. And do we need further legislation? And I'm thinking of the Trust making recommendations for climate action. Now, this Trust is not being set up to solve everybody's problems, and it's not set up to tell anybody what to do at all. Because all of us, every business is fiercely independent, and don't you tell me what to do. And I think most organisations are the same. Don't tell us what to do. However, can you give us some valid information, some really reliable information that we can make our own decisions on? And that's the role of the Trust, is to collect the information, to listen to speakers like we heard tonight, say, hang on, we put that idea with that idea with that idea, and we work with Melissa and Caroline. I think there's something might go here. Nigel, do you want to be part of that? That's the sort of role I see the Trust playing. Having that overview, looking at things that most of us just don't have time to do. So I'm promoting this idea of a Trust, and we will be looking for sponsorship from various organisations. Just letting you know that that's where we're hoping this climate change work will go to. It'll shift into something a bit more formal with a bit more horsepower. So if you need further information, feel free to contact me or Rhys, or go to the Timaru District Council website. I'm not sure how long it will be before we get tonight's presentation on that site, but it will be coming. So there's some really good information there. And finally, look, I'd just like to express great thanks to the speakers. You know, they've given up a lot of time. They've sat here for 3 hours tonight, answered questions. I'd like to thank Timaru District Council for underwriting the work we've been doing on the climate strategy. And in particular, thanking them for letting me be independent and a bit obnoxious and getting on with the job. Because I'm really trying to work with what the community wants on this work. I really want to thank Rhys and Troy. These guys tend to work in the background quite a lot. I brought Rhys into the foreground tonight, but he and I have some superb debates about where all this work is going. So thank you, Rhys, for that. Troy's also superb on the electronic side of things, but he's done a whole lot of other work in the background, so Troy, I appreciate that. I'd like to thank our advisory group, and we've got, as part of our climate change strategy, is about 24 people, and I just really appreciate your assertiveness. And most of all, I want to thank all of you for coming along, giving up 3 hours of your time on a winter's evening. I hope you can go away saying, I learned a whole lot of stuff there, I don't know how to put it together, it's too big, it's whatever it is. You'll each have your own reaction to this, but thank you for coming along and supporting, you know, what we're trying to do here. So that's it.